Hello, and welcome to the Massey College Press Club conversation brought to you by the William Southam Journalism Fellows. My name is DUNCAN, and I am one of this year's fellows. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that Massey College is on in Toronto. I started life in the land of Accra, Ghana, which is my ancestral land. I come from two tribes, the Funti tribe of my father, the people who live by the water, and the Akwapim tribe of my mother, the people who live in the mountains. My parents brought me to Toronto when I was very young, and I'm honored to recognize this land, which has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. We are on the traditional territory of the Wendat Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, Toronto is still home to so many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we at Massey are honored to have the privilege to live and work on this land and share what we have to offer. Now, before I introduce our topic, I want to make a note to any journalist who is watching that the Massey Fellowship is awesome. It's awesome. If you're a journalist who could use a break and you want to stay in the journalism community while learning at your leisure in a university setting with a livable stipend, this is for you. Highly recommend. 10 out of 10. You can apply. The deadline is March 15th. And if you have any questions, you can find me on Twitter at Nanaba. Okay, on to our topic for today. How has COVID-19 changed journalism? I want to remind you of the chat function in YouTube. If you've got any questions, just post them in the chat. We're honored to have all of our guests today, and I'm going to yield the floor to our moderator, Kristen Hare. Kristen is a reporter for the Poynter Institute, and she covers the transformation of local news and writes feature obits for the Tampa Bay Times. She also recently wrote a thorough roundup of the effects of the pandemic on U.S. newsrooms. Kristen spent 5 years as the Sunday features writer and an assistant editor at the St. Joseph News Press, and 5 years as a staff writer covering race, immigration, and aging at the St. Louis Beacon. Please welcome Kristen Hare.
Thank you so much, Lanaba. It's wonderful to see your face, and I am very happy to be here with you guys today. I want to start by introducing our guests. Mark Ipe is the managing editor at Global Edmonton with a decade of experience overseeing various newsrooms in both print and broadcast environments. Before that, he held senior management roles at the Edmonton Journal, Edmonton Sun, and the Telegraph Journal in New Brunswick. Mark, welcome.
Thank you.
CHARMAINE de Silva is the news director of News 1130 and City News Vancouver, one of Canada's largest local newsrooms. She's a 3-time National RTDNA Award winner, and last year received an Edward R. Murrow Regional Award for a series on why pride still matters. A brown-skinned lesbian millennial, CHARMAINE takes pride in being an atypical newsroom boss, and she's passionate about fostering a truly diverse and inclusive culture and challenging norms in media. CHARMAINE, hello.
Hi, Kristen.
And finally, April LINDGREN is the Velma Rogers Research Chair and Principal Investigator for the Local News Research Project at Ryerson School of Journalism. Her research focuses on local news poverty, where local media are not addressing the critical information needs of communities. April spearheaded the crowdsourced local news map, which tracks changes to local news ecosystems. Before working at Ryerson, April spent 20 years reporting on Parliament Hill and at Queen's Park in Toronto. April, welcome.
Thank you.
I am so happy to get to spend time with you all today. Welcome to all of you. Before we got started, we were chatting in the green room about the weather, and I will tell you, as a Floridian, I am honor bound not to talk about the weather, but I hope wherever you are right now and wherever you're watching this, you are warm and safe and have everything you need and can settle in for the next hour and enjoy our discussion. I'm going to start with a question for everyone, but I want to remind you that if you want to ask us questions, go ahead and do so, and we will get to them at the end. So we're going to start with a question for everybody, and it's about the landscape of the news in Canada, nearly a year into this pandemic. April, I want to start with you, and I I love the term news poverty. It is not one that I've heard before. In the US, we say news deserts, and I think news poverty is so much better a description of the impact on consumers and communities, right? So you have spent years tracking and mapping the challenges facing local news. What has the last year done to that picture?
Well, I run, as you mentioned, Kristen, the local news map that has been tracking changes to media, local media dating back to 2008. But when the pandemic was declared on March 11th of last year, and we started seeing headline after headline about publications being suspended temporarily and layoffs, we thought this would be a moment in time, not hoping it wouldn't have lasted so long, but a moment in time to put in a special effort and figure out what the impact of COVID was, of the pandemic. So we actually created a second map called the COVID-19 Media Map for Canada that tracks changes to local media since the World Health Organization declaration of the pandemic on March 11th. And we just did an update this week, and the data tell us that 34 local news organizations have closed, and another 28 have closed temporarily, apparently, and we are not sure of their fate yet. So that's 62 news organizations that have stopped working. Some of these have come back, but certainly that's kind of an opening indication. There's been an acceleration of news organizations moving online. 44 newspapers have canceled some or all of their print editions. 179 media organizations have announced layoffs or job losses. And we've tried to track job losses, and have made a note of 3,000 editorial and non-editorial positions having been affected by the pandemic. Now, some of those jobs have come back, some are still in limbo, but we certainly know that 1,200 are permanent job losses, editorial and non-editorial positions. So maybe I'll just stop there after the litany of horror. And
well, I want to ask a follow-up, April. How did those rates compare with regular years in the past? Because we know in the US that our closures and our layoffs are much accelerated. Does that compare similarly?
Actually, no, it's a little bit, I mean, right, as of the data that we have now, there were 50 local news organizations that had closed in 2020. And there were 69 actually in 2018, which was actually even a worse year. But I think it might be a bit skewed because some of the cutbacks and losses have not been local; they've been at the national level, and so we don't have that reflected necessarily in the annual data from the map. And also, yeah, I mean, some news organizations have been suspended, but they're not permanently closed, so that's also not reflected in our overall numbers at year-to-year comparisons.
Great.
So it's not great.
Yeah. Charmaine, I want to talk to you next. In the US, this was a big year for accountability in newsrooms that still don't look like their communities because they're still largely white and male. What did you see happen this year in newsrooms across Canada?
Well, this is a year, and I think it's been said several times, more than several. This has been a year of an awakening. I think it's obviously the combination of COVID and the conversations around justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion that have been happening, not just in the US, but also in Canada, particularly after the death of George Floyd. There's been a real conversation, right? It was a tipping point. And we have seen these conversations and the focus on this very important topic before. But I think many acknowledge that this year, I think with the combination of the pandemic, that things have felt different. And so I know that these are conversations that are happening not just in newsrooms, but around management tables across a variety of organizations. And I think there is a real push to follow through on what's being asked of us. And, I can only speak for what I see within the organization I work for. But there's a push to follow through on commitments, I think, that have been made in the past, not just having a conversation for the time being because it's a hot topic and because people are talking about it, but also understanding that it's important for the longevity of our industry that we do reflect our community, right? We know this about content. If we want our content to matter, it needs to, hit the entire community, not just sections of the community. And I think there is a real understanding, not just the altruistic angle of it, but even as a business proposition, we need to create content that matters to everybody. So that's been an important, I think, realization. And then on the flip side of it, I think this pandemic has also been an important opportunity for newsrooms to talk about mental health and culture. And that also ties into the conversation around diversity, right? We have heard and we know from the most marginalized members of our newsrooms that these environments have often not felt like safe spaces to share how folks really feel. And the emotional labor that often comes with either being a person of color, a queer person, a woman in newsrooms. And so the pandemic has created, I think, a scenario where we're having these conversations, and now it's on leadership in these organizations to follow through and actually act on the conversations that we're having either at the grassroots level from employees in newsrooms, stories being shared on social media, and then actually carry those through.
Great, thank you, Mark. This was a year for all the news, regardless of where you live and what you cover. I know most journalists I know around the world have felt like they were on a hamster wheel, and this has been, we used to have news cycles, remember those? And now we are in one continuous, never-ending news Ouroboros. What did this year feel like for you and this last year and your newsroom?
I should preface it with saying I myself was actually laid off from a previous job at the start of 2020 and ended up back in the newsroom by the middle of the year. And so I sort of watched the pandemic, the first few months of the pandemic, as a news consumer and not as a journalist. And I guess through the eyes of a journalist, but as a news consumer, which was different, which was a different way to see it. And I, like everybody else, was sort of wanted every bit of news that I could get out of it. Once I was back in a newsroom, the hamster wheel analogy is perfect. It's exactly what is what it feels like. In a lot of ways, it feels like every day we're almost incrementally moving the needle on the stories, because there is, it's the daily updates on numbers. It's how many cases, how many tests, positivity rates, all these things that have become part of our lexicon that were not a year ago. And I think it's been a very difficult year, I think, because as you said, there's no news cycle. The news cycle is basically coverage of COVID-19. And it's hard to report on anything without COVID touching it. So whether you're reporting on education, whether you're reporting on health, of course, whether you're reporting on sports, whether you're reporting on arts, COVID has touched everything. And it has, I think it's changed the way we see stories right now, because it is all COVID related and we're all living in it and it's a part of our daily life. I think within the newsroom, that's no different. I mean, again, it's the practicality of sending people out on assignments, making sure people have the appropriate equipment, the appropriate masks, they're doing the appropriate distancing, what facilities we can go to, what we can't go to. It's a learning experience, and it's always changing. So you're constantly readjusting as whether it's government restrictions that change, or we decide, or new science comes out that says that we should be doing one thing or another. So it's been, I think, an enormous learning experience for everybody, certainly for myself and for news managers, as we figure out how to cover the news in unprecedented times, frankly.
That's very well put. Yeah, I think if anything, we all are now covering change. That is everybody's beat. I'll give you guys a little sketch of what it's looked like here in the US, where local news went into this pandemic with a pre-existing condition. I spent much of last year tracking layoffs and furloughs and closures like April did, and watching newsrooms at the same time do critical work to keep their communities informed and safe. Today, I added the 71st newsroom in the US that is closed, and we count about 5,000 media jobs, but we have numbers for 1 in 3 on our massive list. So I think that number is woefully inadequate. In the US, we also had an election. I'm not sure if you heard, an insurrection, and the pandemic certainly hasn't ended yet. So it has been a lot, and a lot has changed. I want to talk with each of you about this. So please feel free to jump in anytime. I'm happy to call on you as well, but I don't want to restrict our conversation that way. So I just want to start with, if each of you would tell me about, what do you think are the biggest changes that have resulted from the year that we have lived through so far? We're almost to the anniversary of the pandemic. What's changed? Charmaine, I'm going to make you go first.
Oh, okay. I can go first. I mean, other than, you know, I mentioned a little bit, obviously, about the focus on diversity, which I think is important. I think there's also a really renewed outlook on the health of our employees. I think anybody who works and has worked in a newsroom knows about that push to work while sick, right? Like, this is something that happens in a lot of industries, you know, but COVID has really sort of awakened us up to that prospect of, hey, if you know, should people be coming to work when they're not at their 100%? And I've heard this conversation take place not only in our newsroom, obviously, but in others. There's that, it's almost like that mythology around being a journalist, right? You're tough. You don't let anything stop you from doing your work. You know, a cold or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. I'm going to go into work anyway. But now there's a whole new outlook on that, right? You don't want to be the person, if you have a job that you cannot do from home, you don't want to be the person that is sick and gets everybody else around you sick. So I think there's a conversation around that and how organizations take care of their people when they're sick. I think that's happening. Also around burnout. I think we're having conversations as employers around how we take care of our teams in a way that we haven't before. Because the news cycle has been relentless. It's you know, it's not a news cycle. You know, you mentioned some of the big stories in the US. I'm in Vancouver, and here on top of the pandemic, we had a provincial election. You know, the conversations around race have been emotional for journalists to cover, particularly those in the BIPOC community. And I think, you know, all of that, it takes such a toll on the folks doing the work. And so that's the big thing I've noticed that there is a huge focus on in our organization is, you know, we've always talked about taking care of our people, but it has a new sense. It has a new meaning in this world of COVID.
I have a newsletter that I write weekly for Pointer about local journalists, Charmaine, and I featured a story just last week about the photo editor at the Tampa Bay Times. His name is Boyzell Hosey, and he's just a phenomenal journalist. And last year, he got sick with COVID, and so did several family members, and 2 of whom died. And he talked to me about, being the voice in the newsroom as a Black man who is telling people this summer, George Floyd, this is something we need to watch. This is going to happen locally. This is something we have to care about. Dealing with his own illness and loss, and coming back with a really renewed understanding of how vital mental health is, and that when people are worn out, they have to be able to tap out and rest and renew to come back for the work. And this is a seasoned journalist. I do think we pride ourselves on being tough, and that if that it prevents us at this point from doing our jobs, it is time to reassess the role of mental health in journalism. April, you were going to say something, and when I first started talking to Charmaine, what do you think? What's changed in the last year?
I would highlight 2 things. I mean, I think we're living the reality of why local journalism is so important. People have realized that the surveys show that 63% of people who wanted information about what was going on with the pandemic went to news or online newspaper sites. So I think that this recognition of journalism as being part of the critical infrastructure of communities, whether it's like safe drinking water or an ambulance service, I think became apparent. And I'm not sure that it's 100% recognized, but I think there's a growing recognition of that. So that would be the first point that I would make. And the second one is, I think, and not being able to be there to bear witness personally, I think has been a big challenge for journalists, and something that we're all struggling with. And I'm teaching
I think we lost April. We were afraid that was going to happen, but she's going to come back and join us as soon as she can. And I do want to talk more about what I'm going to follow up with her about what she was talking about. But Mark, from your perspective, what's changed?
I think one of the big things was so many people in our newsroom. We have a portion of the staff working within the newsroom and a large portion working out. And newsrooms are collaborative work environments where we're used to sitting around at a newsroom and yelling things out at each other across the room and talking to each other and gathering, and that part of the job has changed considerably. And while we, before we started this conversation, we all talked about how sick of Zoom we are and those types of conversations, because we thrive on that interaction between people, and that collaboration has changed. And it's changed, but it hasn't gone away, because there has been, certainly what I found here is it requires a lot of people leaning on each other to help each other and to make, somebody making calls for someone else and somebody doing things. So for us, we don't put reporters, and our shooters we don't let them travel in the same vehicle anymore. So now they're in separate vehicles driving to the scene of an accident or whatever site they're going to. Once upon a time, the reporter's sitting in there, the shooter's driving, and they're able to make calls, they're able to do some writing. Now it's requiring, more collaboration. So calling into the desk, have someone call the police for us, have someone do this for us. It's a major change, and in some ways it's good, and you're kind of growing the team, but it has sort of increased the workload or spread the workload out amongst people who weren't necessarily doing that in the past, but you've had to lean on each other a little bit more that way. I think that's that's one major change. In terms of coverage of stories, one of the things that I would say is some of and this isn't new, particular to here, of course, but it's, social inequities in society have become much more, brought much more into the spotlight because of COVID and what we've seen in the pandemic. And I think, issues like homelessness, which have become, we're already an issue in the city, and I think something that people were talking about. COVID has made it has brought it even more sharply into focus, because there's added complications around it that the city has to pay attention to, which in turn forces the public to pay attention to. So we're covering some of these issues that in some ways kind of have always been covered, but may have gotten forgotten in the past, but I think have become a little bit more important. So we've put a little bit more effort into them, I would say.
That's great. One of the changes I've seen as someone who's worked remotely for more than a decade is that newsroom leaders, I think in businesses in general, have realized that it is possible to do remote work. I no longer have to apologize for like the sounds of children or a dog in the background, because everybody has something in the background happening. And it's been nice to see people realize what we can do when we have some accommodations. I will be interested to see whenever people go back into newsrooms, for those newsrooms that still have buildings, and there are a lot in the US that no longer do, how the newsrooms themselves change. I think it's going to be interesting to see, and I hope more inclusive, better for women and people with children, people who are caregivers, and people who maybe don't necessarily live as close by as they might if they needed to do a job, but are the best person to do it. So that has been actually for me a really welcome change. April, I want to go back to you. I'm going to ask you a different question, but you had started to answer this already, and that is, what's been essential. I mean, my line to people always is that people, I think, understand, that the national news organizations aren't going to tell me what's happening in my neighborhood, on my street, in my schools, in this, ongoing life and death situation. So what do you think has been essential for journalists and newsrooms in the last year?
Well, I think telling the story of what's happening in the long-term care homes, which has been a huge issue for us in Canada, is a story that only really local media can tell, because there's long-term care homes in every community across the country. So local journalism has done a really important service in keeping people informed about what's happening to their relatives, their family members that are in these long-term care homes. Similarly, how open is the hospital for taking in additional patients as COVID numbers have increased. So as I mentioned earlier, the polling and surveys that have been done show that when it was life and death, 62% or so of people went to online news sites or newspapers for their information. And there seemed to be quite a recognition that that social media, about 30% or so went to social media for COVID information. But I mean, those people have to perform the job of sorting fact from fiction on their own, and at the same time as they can read directly a tweet from the local health officials, they have Uncle Ed's theory about vaccines carrying extraterrestrial germs that are going to have you sending your thoughts to Mars or something. You're also going to encounter that and have to sort through that.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth telling and fact checking to be done, certainly. Charmaine, from your perspective, what has been essential in the last year for newsrooms and journalists?
I would have to agree on the doubling down on local. I think, we started to have this conversation at the start of the pandemic, or the early months, early days of the pandemic, when particularly here in Canada, we saw some of the larger national organizations say that they were going to focus on national, and in fact, cut back on some of their local coverage. And I think it became very clear early on that the audience didn't want that, right? And so those organizations ended up having to sort of backtrack and change, I think, focus on that. And that was an approach that was happening, I think, for quite some time in journalism, trying to nationalize, trying to centralize things, which I think in some ways can make sense. But I think COVID taught us that it's that reminder at the end of the day, the thing that impacts you the most is what's happening in your own backyard, in your own local community. And I think that was a big wake up call. For us, it was actually, and it ended up being great in some ways as a large locally focusing newsroom. We saw, our audience grow massively because of filling that gap in terms of providing that local news coverage, that local angle. We see that often, right? In parts of Canada that might not be Ontario, what is happening in our daily life is very different. We see that, right now with the differences in terms of COVID realities and lockdowns, depending on where you live. And so I thought that was really interesting. The other thing that I found, the conversation around innovation, right? Sometimes innovation is forced out of necessity, and we've had that in our day-to-day news gathering. How are we going to cover things when we can't all be in the same room with each other? How are the ways that hurts journalism? But are there ways in which it helps, right? Does it create opportunities for us to cover more things, tell more stories? And so there's a conversation I think that we're going to be having in the months and years ahead, especially as we face the tail end of this pandemic, about how we tell stories. How do we innovate? What is the audience happy to put up with? One thing that's quite fascinating, I think, also that changes what we do because of the way that the pandemic impacted, I think, so many lives, impacted people's employment. One thing that I'm sure everybody probably noticed is folks are now at home watching the live streams themselves of these news conferences, for example, from public health officials. So that became appointment tuning, right? To watch in to either hear from Dr. Tam, or here in BC, hear from Dr. Bonnie Henry. And the audience is also not just watching what is said in these news conferences, they're actually watching and listening to the types of questions that we ask as journalists. And there is increased dialogue about how we do our job. And I found that to be particularly interesting because I think before COVID, right, everybody's busy. They need us to digest that stuff. I think a lot of people were forced for a number of months, when they couldn't work, when they were at home. What is there to do? Okay, well, we can watch this ourselves, and we can digest this ourselves. And so I think that we are going to see, and we have been hearing, and we will hear more about what people think about how we do our jobs, because they have more of a window into that because they're watching.
That's great. And Mark, what do you think? What has been essential in this last year?
I think it's certainly become more essential, I think, over the last little while, is that as people start to deal with a little more COVID fatigue, I think people are tired of we're all certainly tired of being at home, and our daily lives are so different than they were, but also hearing about the stories and hearing the stories, the numbers are starting to go in one ear and out the other. Like they're not shocking to people anymore. And it's an enormous challenge on our part to make the news. I mean, it's always a challenge to make the news interesting for people, but to make those stories mean something and make them not sound like the story from the day before and the story that we'll do the day after. And so interesting and innovative storytelling, Charmaine talked about some innovation, but it is certainly trying to figure out ways to tell stories and in different ways to tell stories is essential, I think, at this point, because in a lot of ways I do think that people aren't paying attention as they're tuning in, and they certainly are, and it's been good for audience and growing audience that way. But I do think that fatigue is, I'm not sure that they're getting as much out of it, and it's on us to do that, to figure out ways to tell the stories in more original ways and informative ways to get the point across, and certainly to counteract the the misinformation that abounds online all over the place. So that's it. It's essential for us to figure out ways to counteract that. I think is a big part of it.
One of the things that I've seen as really essential in this last year is journalists doing, a job that journalists have always done in writing obituaries and telling us the stories of the people that we've lost because of this pandemic. And that has been a massive undertaking, and newsrooms around the US have done it. The New York Times led with 1,000 obits to mark the 100,000th death of COVID in the US. And that, to me, that kind of reporting is a form of witnessing and giving people space to make sense of numbers that otherwise feel remote and hard to sort of touch. And when you know that this is the person and this is what they did and this is what they loved and this were their family members, that is grueling work. I say that as somebody who does this weekly with an obituary feature and an obituaries newsletter with the Tampa Bay Times, but it feels really important to connect people back to the people in their communities that they've lost. And I don't know anybody else other than newsrooms, particularly local newsrooms, that really know how to do that. I wonder how you all think we're going to emerge from this pandemic whenever we get to do that. Are we going to be battle hardened? Are we going to be worn down? Are we going to go quit and work for Facebook? What, maybe we'll, close up and, start that Etsy shop we've been meaning to start. I don't know, what, I think everybody's story is going to be different, but as an industry, I wonder what you think this absolutely historic and unprecedented experience will mean to our community. Charmaine, I want to start with you. What do you think this is going to mean to us?
Well, I think that really depends on the approach that we take, right? Within our own newsrooms and our organizations. I think if you show your people that you care about them, you care about, their development, you're listening, and you're watching out for signs that they're not doing okay. Like, I think, all of the things that perhaps in other, you read about organizations and the organizations that succeed and organizational health. I think sometimes newsroom culture hasn't really, fostered some of those principles that we know creates winning teams. And I think the answer to your question is it depends, right? Like, I'm really passionate about making sure that our place is a great place to work, that people feel supported, that we can have uncomfortable conversations, that people feel safe raising concerns about what's happening, and that we follow through on the commitments we make. I think COVID, you joked about the Etsy shop, but I think this situation has taught us all, whether it's in our professional lives or our personal lives, about what's important, right? Being separated from your loved ones and your family highlights the importance of that. Those relationships. I think the same for teams, right? What kind of environment and what kind of team are you fostering? And so I think if we come out of that and take those lessons to heart and create environments where people want to thrive, then there is an opportunity to have, I think, work cultures that are even better than before. I think for some people, it's probably an awakening that maybe this isn't for them. I think that's true, right? I think it's similar. We did a story about divorce. Divorce expected to be on the rise after through COVID, because, you know, people assess how happy they are. And I think, you know, there are people who are burnt out, and that's fair. And so we may see some of that as well. And I think there for others, there's going to be, you know, a real awakening around passion for doing this work. What types of stories are most important to them? And I'm actually particularly heartened by some of the work, the incredible work that I'm seeing from BIPOC journalists across Canada, who feel that this time has given them a voice to maybe share stories and explore topics that they didn't feel comfortable doing before. So if we come out of it making space for that, then I think we win. But there are plenty of ways that we can come out of this with the wrong focus as well. And that's on all of us as leaders.
Mark, how do you think we come out of this as a community, or how do you hope your newsroom is going to emerge from this pandemic?
I mean, a lot of what Charmaine said, I 100% agree with. I do think that there's going to be a lot of assessment on reporters or on journalists to decide whether they want to stick with it or not. I think there's going to be a lot of them are going to come out a bit hardened by it. I think that was the term that you used. It's a bit hardened by it because it's tough. I mean, in some ways, I can almost, you know, fast forward 10 years from now, and you can imagine the people talking to the young journalists about that time, you know, the 2 years that they spent in a newsroom during the pandemic and what it was like and how tough it was. And I can almost picture that conversation in my head, how that's going to go. But what I would say is I think that there's a lot of journalists are probably going to come out of this with, you know, kind of going back to that word innovation. I mean, I think they're going to come out of this with new ways of telling stories that they'd never seen before. I think we're going to come out of this with a whole other view on storytelling. I hope that we come out of this with a whole other way on storytelling that can benefit the viewer, benefit the readers of our work. I think that it is a challenge to come up with new ways, and we've always been, you know, journalism is an ocean liner. It's slow to turn, and we sit with traditional ways often to our own detriment often. I hope that this helps to push us to you know, see what works and some of the, you know, new techniques and new things that we're doing now. I hope that we come out with a new way of doing it that can help the industry do better in the future, frankly, and better serve the local news audience, which has, we've proven our worth, I'd like to think, during COVID. So I'm hoping that that's sort of where we end up on the other end of this, which who knows whenever that is.
How about for you, April? How do we emerge from this in the mystical, magical future, whenever it happens?
Well, I mean, I think one of the big challenges is that local businesses have been struggling, and the local advertising that they have provided has, in many ways, just evaporated for the most part. So how do those businesses come back to life, and then how does the advertising come back to life along with it? And I think that's going to force some changes, and innovation that it would actually be positive. For instance, I'm a big fan of the idea of, instead of a local radio, local television, and a local newspaper struggling in a market to each cover the same stories out of City Hall, to look for some space for collaboration and use that those collaborative approaches to do this sort of more in-depth public interest kind of journalism that none of them could do on their own, but collectively they can do together.
Okay, well, April, we'll come back to us again. Charmaine, what effect do you think the pandemic will have on efforts to make newsrooms more diverse and on the rise of independent journalism? We've seen, a reckoning and a recognition. We have seen continued continued push. And like you said in the beginning, not just like, a meeting, we're going to talk about it. It's going to make headlines and it's going to go away for another 5 years. So what effect do you think this will have on making newsrooms look more like the communities that they serve?
Well, I think, the conversation is being had. We're hearing demands that we make this happen. So I think, once again, that's another, it's on us. What do we do? I know that we're definitely committed to this. We were before this conversation started. And, it starts, I think we've been talking about this as an industry, right? It's not just about hiring journalists from diverse backgrounds. It's about making sure that journalists from diverse backgrounds rise up through the ranks and occupy seats in management positions and around those tables where decisions are being made, and that we ensure that happens. And so I think we're seeing that. We're certainly seeing that. I think that the big question is some of this stuff reactionary, and is it going to be a long-term commitment? And I think in many cases, this does obviously create more work, more emotional labor for BIPOC journalists in those positions, in newsrooms, advocating for this. I think that's been a reality for forever. So I think people are watching to see, what are the allies doing? Is it just talk? And I am I'm always hopeful, a bit of an optimist. I do feel like the expectations now are different, and I think that also comes with each new generation, right? As a parent, I see the world of the expectations that my kids have through their lens. It's different. The expectations for some of the things that we think are special in terms of diversity, it's just their expectation. So I think over time, particularly out of this conversation, it's going to be on us to actually affect those changes. I'm seeing some of that work, right? I'm seeing this in hiring decisions, but the big question is this reactionary? Is this short term? Is this going to continue beyond 2021, 2020? Because we've seen that cycle. We have, right? We've seen it before where there's a major event. There's, we have our conversations around diversity. Everybody makes their commitment. They do a little bit of work. But I think there is more weigh-in, Kristen. I think there's more buy-in, than there has been before. And I don't know if it took the rawness of the pandemic combined with the emotion of the conversations around race that we've had. But I do feel like it's different this time.
Yeah, it feels like that to me too. I also, April, feel like, we talked earlier that people are recognizing the real value of local news and what local news, brings to a community. I wonder, April, how does local news continue to prove itself valuable after the danger ends?
Well, I don't think the pandemic is going to end immediately. So I think it's going to be sort of a gradual change. And as we discussed earlier, the whole issue of equity and social justice, I think have really been, a lot of those issues have been laid bare, and that there is a lot of work for newsrooms to do in terms of pursuing those stories within their communities, and looking at the racial divides that the pandemic has exposed, and the economic divides, and the and even to a certain extent the age divide that has been exposed within communities, and that we papered over for so long. And it's there and it's really obvious. And I think that there's a really important role for local journalism to be telling those stories going forward.
Great. I'm told that we have some really great questions coming from YouTube, from our viewers. So we'll just go through them. Aaron says, although there have been job losses and closures at particular papers and magazines, have there been media outlets that have grown during the pandemic? For example, have subscriptions gone up at long-standing reputable media outlets because people were keen to have reliable information? Does anybody want to take that? I can give a perspective from the US, but I'd rather hear from you guys.
Well, I can say that there have been certainly some subscription bumps that news organizations have experienced, and also some innovations. I was just talking with the public affairs officer in a small town called High Level, Alberta, which is way in the north of that province. And there is a local paper in town, but it doesn't really have any reporters on staff. It has one freelancer. And there was a real sense that there was a lack of, it was really difficult for the town to get information out. And so the town purchased a subscription for every household in the community, and used the one free page of it got in each edition of the paper each week to put its announcements out there. Now, I mean, obviously there's some ethical challenges there. You, if you're the editor of that newspaper, you might hesitate about doing a nasty story about the municipality if it's your main paying for all or most of your subscriptions. But I think that's an example of subscription interest in subscriptions. But I mean, apart from that, other newsrooms have enjoyed a bump.
Yeah, we've seen, particularly online local newsrooms have been the straight A well-behaved child of newsrooms. So it's not getting attention. It's flying under the radar because it's doing all the right stuff, unfortunately. And we're focused on the legacy newsrooms that are struggling. Those newsrooms, those local online newsrooms are also very lean. Often the people who have founded them don't pay themselves for a number of years, and they don't have the same costs of production that legacy newsrooms have. Those newsrooms have very rarely made my list. Let's take another question from our YouTube audience if we have some. So Duncan says, there's always been tension between health professionals, scientists, and journalists in getting information out. Have we learned anything about how to better communicate for the benefit of public health? That's a great question, Duncan. Does anybody want to take that one? Have we learned how to better communicate with public health officials?
I think what I would say is communication has been, certainly speaking for here, communication has been fairly poor from health officials out to the public. It is just, it's the daily briefings are, frankly, have become appointment television. Everybody's sitting waiting for that 3:30 news conference every day. At the beginning, I think we saw both here and across the country, certainly here, the health officials became celebrities. I mean, they were, the public health officials stood on those podiums every day, and they became, people wanted to know where to buy the dress that our local public health official was wearing, and it was like that was to the extent of it, and but that has changed, and it's sort of been a reversal in terms of the mistrust. But then you've also seen, we actually did a story on sort of local health celebrities in terms of physicians or epidemiologists who at the universities who have become these communicators. And I think over the course of the last year, they've become better at communicating ideas, and we've been better at soliciting those ideas to try to explain some of the more technical aspects of the public health measures and trying to get that message across. I think we've probably learned lessons going forward on how to deal with some of those things. So I do think we've gotten better, and it's been an education process on our side as well as I think on the health official sides on how to communicate those getting their message across. Obviously there's when the public health officials get up, there's that politicization there's that concern of politicization, let's say. Certainly in this province, there's that concern from a lot of people in the public, and it has to be balanced out with clear facts and clear storytelling on our part. So I do think it's gotten better, and we're getting better, but again, it's a challenge to always try to find the most succinct, easiest way to get that information out that's truthful and beneficial to the public.
Here in Florida, we had such a mess with the beginning of the vaccine rollout that one reporter at the Tallahassee Democrat became like a go-to call-in line for seniors who are trying to figure out how to get signed up for the vaccine. And I think a lot of journalists have better understandings of public health. She was an education reporter than they ever would have before, just in navigating those systems. I'm sorry, Charmaine, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, to speak, I think to the point that Mark was mentioning at the start. The control, right? The control over the messaging, especially when you can't have your teams in the same room as those health officials and demanding the follow-up questions and sort of shouting it out when you are forced to be on a telephone line or some sort of wait for your turn, and somebody else has the control over whether you have a follow-up question or not. And in I know it's been the case, and the frustration here in BC is, there's only a certain allotment of time, and who gets those questions? Who gets to ask the questions every single day? Do some outlets get more? Are they favored compared to other outlets? And I can tell you as a news director, it takes up a lot of, it has taken up some of my time advocating for why it's important to get questions, and then also appeasing, my journalists who are upset when, maybe they don't get a question and they have important questions to ask, and you lose that environment. I think just like with everything else, the impact of communications and PR professionals on crafting the message, we're seeing that. I think Mark mentioned it, but here in BC, Dr. Bonnie Henry has turned into a celebrity. The Fluvog shoes had one made in her honor that sold out in like 2 minutes. But everything that goes up must come down. And there's also on social media right now a huge amount of sort of commentary, sort of questioning her expertise, and there's fear and anxiety around the messaging and whether we're getting everything. I think journalists are also asking questions about data. We've seen incredible discrepancies in the types of data that different jurisdictions make available, right? And so, watching this commentary about what's available from health officials in Ontario compared to BC, compared to Alberta, and why can't we all have the same type of information so that we can compare? I think these questions have been raised. We're not getting good answers about it. So I think it has, in many ways, it's raised a bunch of questions that we need to get to the bottom of. But while we're trying to do our job, there's this other huge industry out there that's continuing to control messaging around that, and health officials getting their, what they want as a message out there is no different. They're spending, governments are spending a ton of money on communication in the name of public interest. But a lot of that, we have to question, is it actually in the public interest or is it in their interest?
Here comes another question from Jessica. Do you feel that live streaming is potentially taking over the live news industry?
I don't know that it's taking over it. It would be my answer. I think it's in addition to. I think there are always going to be some people who want, the behind the scenes look, or they want to see it for themselves. there's an audience for all sorts of things. I think of, my teenager showed me this thing on YouTube. I didn't realize this was a thing where people will watch other people watching movies. And I'm like, why would you want to watch that? Like, what's in it for you? But there are people, there's entire YouTube channels of YouTube celebrities who do this, right? Like they put a video. So I think in that respect, there are going to be some people who like consuming the live stream themselves, seeing that information. I do think, though, at the end of the day, there are a lot of people just like us who have jobs, who have families, who have things to do, who are going to want that information dissected, translated, and given to them in manageable bits and pieces that make sense to them. And so I do think that's going to continue to exist. I think this is just an addition to, it's sort of like reality TV news style.
That's great. How many of the changes you described do you think will be permanent and last even after the pandemic is over, or will things more or less go back to the way they were? That's from Fuzzy Nosed Wombat, which is a very good username. We talked about this a little, I think maybe even before we started, but are we going back? Are we ever going back to the way things were, or are we going to have some of the changes we've been through stick around?
I think there's going to be some permanent changes. I mean, many of this, we've discovered things that work that we were reluctant to try, whether it was working from home and the opportunities that might present for diversifying newsrooms. On the other hand, there's going to be I think a whole bunch of new challenges. First of all, the number of people that have been lost from newsrooms often were the younger and more diverse hires who were the last people in, and in some cases have been the first people out. So I think there's going to be, that's going to be a challenge to recoup that and build upon the sorts of things in the sort of way that Charmaine has talked about diversifying newsrooms. If I could just say on that point, I think one of the real tests will be whether newsrooms are actually willing to do audits and actually be accountable and put out some numbers out there, either internally or externally, to show that they are making real change and real commitments.
Speaking to that change and what could change, what may or may not change, I think what as Charmaine brought up with the news conferences and dealing with government officials, that is my biggest fear in terms of that they go back to live news conferences, that we're back to being able to scrum politicians, to be able to yell questions out, to be able to get follow-up questions. So often, like right now, frankly, it doesn't work, and it's not that control is so intense sometimes, frankly, that we're not able to appropriately question public policy issues, major public policy issues that affect the health, the bank accounts, the employment, you name it, it affects it, and we're not able to appropriately do that. So in terms of on the news side for us, yeah, I think there's probably some permanent changes. We're going to be doing some interviews by Zoom. When we're trying to interview somebody in the far north of the province who is an 8-hour drive away, the Zoom is brilliant, and maybe now our audience is used to that, seeing interviews that way, and that's a good thing for being able to reach remote parts of the country. But on the flip side of that, I want to make sure that there are certainly some live aspects that come back in terms of allowing us to question politicians and meet with politicians, and those face-to-face interactions that help us dig deeper and get closer to the truth, frankly.
Great. Let's take another question. Elizabeth says, in a world where the volume of data and information has gone up exponentially while newsrooms have been under financial pressures over the last 15 to 20 years, how do journalists and journalism remain relevant and continue to inform the public?
I think, the thing that stands out is our ability to identify what matters, right? There's a ton of information out there, but what actually resonates? Who's sifting through that information? I know we have ongoing questions and conversations around public trust. I think that is something that, all of us and our industry has to face. And there are conversations around the access to information and what's not legit and what's legit that's out there, especially the role that various social media platforms play in that. But I think if we remain committed to, sharing stories that actually matter to people and sifting through that data in a way that makes sense to all of the communities, I think there's going to be a role for us. And I think there's, as I mentioned at the start of this conversation, we've identified that there are entire communities that we have not been serving. So, how do we pivot to make sure that the stories that we're telling reflect what's important to everybody? I think there's an enormous untapped potential there. So there's this data that's been out there that nobody's been talking about. And sure, people can go out and get that information, but a lot of them don't, right? Particularly people from communities that face all sorts of barriers. So I think, it's on us, again, to go out there, find those stories and tell those stories in a way that actually resonates with everybody. And I think that's the opportunity for us to survive in the face of this information being out there. And at the same time, while there are places and spaces for data to be accessible, as I mentioned, there's entire industries that are dedicated to making sure that that data is not accessible. So who's fighting to make sure that we have access to that? And there are so many incredible investigative journalists across this country doing that work, filing those FOIs, pushing for that. And so there's going to continue to be a role for journalism, even in the face of all of these data dumps.
Yeah, if I can just jump in on that too. I mean, I think that people tend to forget that there's a difference between information and journalism. And what journalism gives you is verified, timely, independently produced information versus just information that may or may not be true. So I think that if you think about that distinction, there's information and then there's journalism. That's where you get the value proposition or the value of journalism being identified.
That's great. I'll see if we have any more questions from YouTube. I would just add, I think the most important thing we can do right now is help people make sense of what's happening. Oftentimes they will find it out. They know the news before it's fully developed. Our goal at Poynter is always to tell the day two story on day one. And so it's all about context and making sense of something. So not just what, but how and why and where and who and all of those things that matter. Listen, guys, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy day to talk with us. And thank you to the audience for taking the time to participate. You have asked fabulous questions. This has been enlightening. I also want to thank Massey College and the William Southam Journalism Massey Fellows for organizing this press club event. As mentioned before, applications are open now for the fellowship and the deadline is March 15th. So get on it. And for more information, go to masseycollege.ca. My name is Kristen Hare. Thank you so much for having me as your moderator and have a great night.